The snowstorm had already swallowed the trail. Every step was a battle, the cold biting through his boots as the man trudged deeper into the forest. And then, he heard it. A faint cry. Weak. Desperate. He pushed through the branches and froze. There, tangled in a fallen trap, was a wolf cub. Its paw twisted, its body trembling, its eyes wide with terror. And behind him, the shadows moved. Amber eyes glowed in the tree line. Not one. Not two. A dozen. The pack was watching. One wrong move, and he wouldn't make it out alive. But if he walked away, the cub would die. His breath caught in the icy air. He had to decide, save himself, or save the cub. The pack had arrived. Shadows shifted between the trees, circling, watching. Low growls rippled through the air, deep and threatening. The man's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to leave the cub, to run while he still had a chance. Wolves weren't forgiving. And a trapped cub was a spark that could ignite fury. But then the cub let out another pitiful cry. Its eyes locked on his, wide, pleading, innocent. And something inside him shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to one knee. His gloved hands brushed snow away from the trap. The metal was cold and cruel, biting into the cub's paw. He winced at the sight of blood against white snow. The growls grew louder. The pack edged closer. Easy, he whispered, though his voice was nearly lost in the storm. I'm not here to hurt you. The cub whimpered, flinched, but didn't pull away. He tugged at the trap. It didn't budge. Rusted steel locked tight. He adjusted his grip, forced his frozen fingers into the hinge. Pain lanced through his knuckles as the sharp edge bit his glove, but he pressed harder. The wolves moved closer now, their shapes clearer. Massive bodies, thick winter coats dusted with snow, heads low, teeth bared. The air vibrated with their growls. One step too close. One wrong sound. And he'd be finished. The trap groaned, just barely. The hinge creaked, then shifted. With a final grunt, he forced it open enough for the cub to yank its paw free. The little creature stumbled, collapsed in the snow, then scrambled back onto its trembling legs. It looked at him once more, eyes wide, ears pressed low, before hobbling toward the shadows. The pack parted to let it through. Silence. The wolves no longer growled. They stood motionless, amber eyes fixed on him. Steam rose from their muzzles, clouds against the frozen night. He stayed perfectly still, his chest heaving, frost clinging to his beard. For the first time, he wondered if freeing the cub had sealed his fate. Because now the pack wasn't just watching. They were deciding. And he had no idea which way their judgment would fall. The snow fell harder, swirling like shards of glass in the wind. His knees ached from crouching, but he didn't move. Every muscle in his body screamed to run, yet he knew, turning his back on them would be the end. The pack was silent now. Silent in a way that felt heavier than growls. The cub had hobbled into their midst, pressing against the legs of a massive she-wolf whose fur was streaked silver with age. She lowered her head, sniffed the cub's wounded paw, then lifted her eyes back toward him. Amber. Piercing. Unblinking. The kind of stare that pinned a man in place, weighed his soul, and found out if he belonged to the forest, or against it. The wolves shifted in a loose circle, their paws crunching in the snow. He could feel the weight of every eye. A dozen shadows, watching. Judging. His breath came slow, measured. He forced his hands to stay open, visible. No sudden movements. No threat. The largest male, a towering wolf with a scar across his muzzle, stepped forward. His fur bristled, steam rising from his jaws as a low growl rumbled from his chest. Snow clung to his coat, the storm crowning him like a beast carved from the mountains themselves. The man swallowed hard. He could hear his own pulse in his ears. This was it. The alpha stopped just feet away. His massive paws pressed into the snow, ears forward, nose flaring as he sniffed the man's scent. The growl deepened, vibrating the air between them. One lunge. One snap. That's all it would take. But the man didn't flinch. He lowered his gaze, not in fear, but in respect. He kept his head bowed slightly, acknowledging the beast's dominion. The silence stretched. Then, without warning, the Alpha stepped closer, close enough that the man could see the frost clinging to his whiskers. The wolf's breath puffed hot against the man's face. His lips curled back, exposing fangs as long as knives. The man closed his eyes for half a second, ready for pain. It never came. Instead, the wolf's growl stopped. The Alpha sniffed once, huffed, then stepped back. The circle of wolves parted slightly, the tension loosening like a string finally released. The man exhaled slowly, his chest tight with disbelief. The cub whimpered from the safety of the she-wolf's side, limping but alive. The silver wolf licked its head, then turned once more toward him. Her ears flicked back, and with a low, throaty sound, she nudged the cub toward the circle. The message was clear. They knew what he had done. The pack moved in unison now, not to attack, but to surround. Their shapes blended into the storm, shadows with glowing eyes, silent and purposeful. The man rose slowly to his feet, snow clinging to his coat. His legs trembled, not from cold, but from the sheer weight of what had just passed. He had freed a cub under the watch of its entire family, and lived. But something deeper stirred in the silence. This wasn't mercy. This was acknowledgement. The pack had seen his choice, to risk himself for one of their own. And now, their eyes no longer burned with hostility. They gleamed with something far stranger. Recognition. He was no longer just an intruder. He was something else. Something they hadn't decided yet, but something they would not forget. The Alpha tilted his head back, and with a sudden, shattering cry, howled into the storm. The sound tore through the forest, long and powerful, a voice that declared the night was theirs. One by one, the others joined in. The air vibrated with their chorus, rising and falling like waves against stone. The cub nestled closer to its mother, safe again. And through it all, the man stood frozen, the howl resonating through his bones. He realized, with a clarity that shook him, that he had just stepped into something greater than himself. The pack had passed judgment. And for reasons he could barely comprehend, they had chosen to let him live. The storm eased as dawn broke, the sky softening to a pale gray. Snowflakes still drifted, but the blinding curtain had lifted. The man stood for a moment longer, chest heaving, before finally daring to move. His boots crunched as he stepped back from the circle of wolves. To his surprise, they didn't lunge. They didn't chase. They simply watched. Dozens of amber eyes, glowing faintly in the thinning darkness. He swallowed, turned, and began the long trudge back down the trail. His hands shook from the cold, his coat heavy with snow. He kept his pace steady, forcing himself not to look back. Step after step, the silence pressed on him. The forest was alive again, branches creaked, wind whispered, distant crows cawed, but he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes still on him. Finally, at a bend in the trail, he glanced over his shoulder. And his heart nearly stopped. They were there. The wolves. Not in a tight circle anymore, but spread through the trees, silent shadows slipping between trunks. Their paws left faint prints in the snow, almost soundless. Every time he thought one had disappeared, another shape emerged just ahead, just behind, always keeping pace. He froze. His breath plumed in the cold air. Were they following, or hunting? The Alpha appeared on a ridge above, his silhouette sharp against the pale sky. The scar across his muzzle caught the light. He didn't move aggressively. He simply stood, tail high, eyes locked on the man. A warning? A test? Or something else entirely? The man pressed onward, each step heavier than the last. He kept his head low, refusing to provoke them, though every instinct begged him to run. But as he walked, something strange began to happen. The wolves weren't closing in. They weren't narrowing the gap for an ambush. If anything, they kept distance, almost deliberate. When he stumbled in the snow, slipping on hidden ice, a low growl rippled from the trees. Not a threat, but a signal. He paused, glanced sideways, and realized, A lone coyote had been trailing the edge of the path. The growl drove it off. His stomach tightened. That wasn't coincidence. He trudged further. Another half-mile, past a frozen creek. His boots slipped through thin ice, plunging his foot into the frigid water. He hissed, dragging himself onto the bank. His hands shook violently as he tried to catch his breath. And again, the silence of the woods broke. This time, a pair of wolves emerged from the trees, low and cautious, not snarling but steady. Their eyes locked onto the tree line behind him, ears twitching. Moments later, he saw it, a mountain cat slinking in the shadows, golden eyes tracking him. It froze when it saw the wolves, tail lashing, before melting back into the trees. The wolves held their ground until it was gone. Then, as silently as they had appeared, they slipped back into the forest. The man's chest tightened. They weren't following him as prey. They were guarding him. The realization struck hard, almost surreal. He walked faster now, testing it. Each time he scanned the trees, there they were. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to watch. Always in step. Always present. When at last he reached the edge of the forest, the snow thinned into open ground. His cabin's roof was visible through the haze. Relief flooded him, but it was laced with something else, a strange, humbling weight. He turned one last time. The ridge was lined with silhouettes. Wolves standing tall against the pale sky, their breath rising in white clouds. The alpha was at the center, eyes locked on him, tail lifted high in silent authority. The man raised a hand, not in fear this time, but in acknowledgement. A gesture of respect. The alpha tilted his head once, almost imperceptibly. Then, with a ripple of movement, the pack melted back into the forest, disappearing as if they had never been there at all. The man stood in the open snow, heart pounding, realizing the truth. He had not walked alone. The forest had chosen to let him live. And in doing so, it had given him something he didn't yet understand, something far greater than survival. A bond. Behind him wasn't empty. He knew it. As he trudged across the final stretch, he kept glancing over his shoulder. At first, there was nothing, only snow, drifting lazily now that the storm had passed. But then, faintly, he saw them. Shadows. A pair of wolves standing at the tree line. Motionless. Watching. When his eyes met theirs, they didn't retreat. They didn't advance either. They simply held their ground, breath fogging in the icy air, tails low but steady. He unlocked the cabin door with trembling fingers, stepped inside, and pushed it shut behind him. Silence. The fire was dead. The room was cold, wooden beams creaking under the weight of snow. He lit the stove with clumsy hands, coaxing flame into life. The warmth spread slowly, thawing his stiff fingers. And yet, he couldn't shake the weight of those eyes outside. Hours passed. He sat by the fire, boots drying, coat steaming in the heat. Exhaustion pulled at him, but every time he drifted, a sound jolted him awake, soft crunching in the snow, the faint shift of weight outside. Finally, unable to resist, he rose and pulled the curtain back. His breath caught. Just beyond the clearing, half hidden by drifting snow, two wolves stood like sentinels. One was the scarred alpha, broad shoulders dusted with frost. Beside him, the silver she-wolf, the cub nestled at her side, paw wrapped but healed enough to hobble. They weren't leaving. He let the curtain fall, his chest tightening with something between awe and disbelief. Why? Why stay here, outside his cabin, hours after the danger had passed? That night, sleep came fitfully. The storm outside faded to a quiet hush, but every so often he heard it, the long, low howl rising in the distance. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't even close. It was steady. Rhythmic. Almost reassuring. The sound seeped into his bones, pulling him deeper into a sleep unlike any he'd had in years. A guarded sleep. When dawn broke, he opened the door cautiously, stepping into the snow. Tracks. Wolf prints circled the cabin, layered and deliberate. Not chaotic. Not random. A perimeter. His throat tightened. They hadn't left. He followed the trail a little further, his boots sinking into fresh snow. The prince looped around the cabin, across the clearing, to the ridge. And there, faint against the pale sky, stood the Alpha once more, watching from above. It wasn't coincidence. It was intention. He raised a hand again, the same gesture as before, though now it carried more weight. This time, he meant it. Respect. Gratitude. The Alpha's ears flicked forward. His tail lifted, a silent command the man didn't need words to understand. The pack began to melt back into the trees again, but not aimlessly. Always toward the ridge, always where they could see him. He trudged back to the cabin, the snow crunching underfoot. His mind spun with questions, but his heart was strangely steady. For years, he had lived alone, tucked away in the wilderness, convinced solitude was the price of survival. Yet now, after one choice, one cub, he was no longer truly alone. The forest had placed eyes on him. Not enemies. Not threats. Guardians. That night, when he set his traplines along the river, he felt it again. The prickle on the back of his neck. The sense of being followed. But when he turned, it wasn't danger he saw. 2 wolves at a distance. One watching the tree lean, the other crouched low, ears twitching. They weren't there to stalk him. They were scanning the woods for something else. And when a distant coyote howl broke through the valley, the wolves answered first, their cries sharp and commanding, pushing the intruder away. The man froze, realizing the truth that finally sank into his bones. This wasn't a chance encounter anymore. It was a bond. And whether he wanted it or not, the pack had claimed him. The morning began quiet. Too quiet. The man stepped out of his cabin, the cold biting sharper than usual. His traps were empty, the snow brittle underfoot. The forest looked the same, but something in the silence was wrong. No crows. No wind. Not even the distant echo of the pack's howls. He crouched low, scanning the tree-ling. And then he saw it, boot prints. Not his. Fresh. Heavy. His chest tightened. Hunters. He followed them just far enough to glimpse the truth. 3 men, rifles slung over their shoulders, their breath fogging in the cold. They were moving quietly, but with purpose. He knew the look in their eyes, the kind that came for more than game. These weren't trappers. They were poachers. And worse, the tracks led toward the ridge. Toward where the wolves roamed. His pulse quickened. If the hunters found the pack, it would be slaughter. The cub he'd freed, the Alpha, the silver she-wolf, all of them. He had to do something. But before he could move, a branch snapped behind him. The hunters had seen him. "Well, look what we've got here," one sneered, raising his rifle. "Cabin man. Out here all alone." Another smirked. "Alone's not the word. He's been walking with wolves." The man froze. How much had they seen? How long had they been watching? The tallest hunter cocked his rifle, the metallic click sharp in the silence. "You lead us to them, old man. Or you don't walk away." The man's jaw clenched. He said nothing. Then movement. A shadow slipped across the ridge. Another. Then more. The hunters didn't notice at first. Their eyes were fixed on him. But the man did. Amber glints, one after another, lighting up in the tree-line. Silent shapes fanning out, circling. The forest itself seemed to draw a breath. And then, the low growl rolled like thunder. The hunters whipped their heads around, rifles snapping up. "What the?" Too late. The Alpha emerged first, massive and scarred, his body tense with fury. The silver she-wolf followed, the cub at her side. Then came the others, a dozen strong, their eyes blazing. The pack had arrived. The hunters stumbled back, panic flaring. "Wolves!" one shouted, aiming blindly into the trees. The man's voice cut through the chaos, steady, commanding. "Don't fire." But fear had already taken hold. A shot rang out, echoing across the valley. Snow exploded from a tree trunk, the bullet gone wide. That was the last mistake. The Alpha lunged, a blur of muscle and teeth. The hunters staggered as wolves erupted from the treeline, circling, snarling, driving them back. Teeth snapped inches from their arms, hurting them with terrifying precision. The man didn't move. He stood tall, steady, watching as the pack defended not just their cub, but him. The silver she-wolf's growl was deep and guttural, her body shielding him as if he were one of their own. Two younger wolves flanked his sides, tails high, their eyes locked on the hunters. The men shouted, stumbled, scrambled. Their rifles swung wildly, but they couldn't aim. The wolves pressed closer, forcing them to retreat step by step toward the treeline. "Get out!" The man's voice boomed, stronger than he thought possible. "This forest isn't yours!" The alpha snapped his jaws, lunging close enough to tear fabric from a hunter's coat. The man dropped his rifle in sheer panic, sprinting for the ridge. The others followed, crashing through snow, their shouts fading into the distance. And then, silence. The wolves didn't chase further. They stopped at the treeline, growls fading into steady breaths. The alpha stood at the front, chest heaving, eyes still burning with fire. Slowly, he turned back toward the man. The forest was still again. But this time, there was no judgment in their eyes. No test. Only recognition. The man's throat tightened. He looked from the cub, alive because of him, to the pack that had just risked themselves for his safety. It was no longer coincidence. No longer survival. This was protection. A promise carved into the snow, sealed not with words, but with loyalty. The pack had chosen. And their choice was him. The forest had fallen silent again, but this silence was different. Not the tense quiet of judgment. Not the deadly hush before an attack. This was the stillness that followed a promise. The hunters' tracks vanished into the trees, their shouts fading into the distance. Only the crunch of the wolves' paws and the man's ragged breath remained. The alpha stood tall at the ridge, chest rising and falling, steam curling from his jaws. His amber eyes fixed on the man, not with suspicion, not with fury, but with something older. Deeper. Recognition. The silver she-wolf stepped forward, the cub limping at her side. Snow clung to its fur, but the wound was healing. It paused, looked at the man, and for the first time, it didn't shy away. It hobbled closer. Step by step. The man knelt slowly, careful not to startle it. His hand, rough and scarred, extended into the cold air. The cub sniffed once, twice, then pressed its head lightly against his palm. His chest tightened. A warmth spread through him, sharper than any fire. The pack stirred, a ripple of movement as they watched the exchange. The silver wolf's ears flicked forward, approving. The alpha huffed, a deep, steady sound, not aggression, not warning. A mark of acceptance. The man rose to his feet again, snow clinging to his coat. He met the alpha's gaze across the clearing. For a long moment, they simply stood, man and beast eye to eye. Then, slowly, the alpha dipped his head. A bow. The howl came next, low, drawn, powerful. The others joined, their voices weaving through the forest, rising into the pale sky. The sound washed over him, not as threat, not as warning, but as oath. He had saved one cub. And in return, he had gained a pack. The man turned back toward his cabin, the weight of solitude lighter than it had ever been. His boots crunched through the snow, but the sound was never alone. Because when he glanced back, the wolves were there. Not too close. Not tethered. But present. Moving as he moved. Watching as he walked. Guardians. Shadows stitched into the forest itself. He knew then that this bond would not end with the snow melt. It was for life. For as long as he drew breath beneath the same sky, the pack would be near. Not pets. Not prisoners. But allies bound by something stronger than words, respect. At the door of his cabin, he paused, turning one final time. The cub had settled at the alpha's side, safe, alive. The pack ringed the clearing like sentinels, their howls fading into the hush of winter. The man lifted a hand in silent thanks. And the alpha, scarred and eternal, raised his muzzle once more. The vow was sealed. From this day forward, he would never walk the wilderness alone. He had earned their loyalty. And in the heart of the wild had given him something far greater in return: protection for life.